In the first decade of the first century, the world belonged to Rome. Its shadow stretched from the sun-scorched sands of Syria to the misty shores of Britannia. Its legions, the most disciplined and devastating fighting force the world had ever known, were the instruments of its will, an iron hammer that had shattered kingdoms and forged an empire. The Mediterranean was a Roman lake, the Alps were a Roman highway, and the great civilizations of Greece, Egypt, and Carthage were but chapters in Rome's glorious history. To be Roman was to be a master of the known world, a citizen of a divinely ordained dominion destined to last for 1,000 years. In BUT, there was a place where the shadow of the eagle faltered, a frontier where the relentless march of progress, law, and order met something primeval, something that refused to be tamed. This was Germania, NTO, the Roman mind. It was a place of barbarism, a vast, untamed wilderness at the very edge of civilization. It was not a land of marble cities and paved roads, but of endless, suffocating forests. These were not the manicured groves of Italy. They were dark, menacing cathedrals of nature, where colossal oaks and beeches, hundreds of years old, formed a canopy so thick that the sun became a distant, fractured memory. The forest floor was a labyrinth of tangled roots, sucking mud and treacherous bogs that could swallow a man whole, leaving not even a ripple. Fog was a constant resident here, a cold, wet shroud that clung to the trees, muffling sound and turning the familiar world into a place of ghosts and whispers. The air itself felt different, heavy with the scent of damp earth, decaying leaves, and the perpetual chill of places untouched by sunlight. This was the Fini Imperii, the end of the empire. Not a line drawn on a map, but a palpable physical barrier. For the legionary, accustomed to the open plains of Gaul or the rocky hills of Hispania, where formations could be held and sightlines were clear, this was a waking nightmare. Every rustle of leaves could be an ambush. Every shadowed hollow could hide a dozen warriors. The very environment was an enemy, as hostile and deadly as any human foe. It was a land that fought back, that resisted the neat, orderly geometry of Roman military thought. You could not build a siege tower against a swamp, nor could you form a testudo against the crushing weight of a falling tree. NFOR decades, Rome had tried to digest this formidable land. Great commanders like Drusus and Tiberius, a future emperor, had led their legions across the Rhine River, the great artery that separated the Roman province of Gaul from the Germanic wilderness. They had pushed deep into the interior, winning battles, burning villages, and forcing chieftains to their knees. They established forts and summer camps, laid down rudimentary roads, and declared the territory between the Rhine and the Elbe rivers to be a new Roman province in the making. They believed, with the unshakable confidence of conquerors, that it was only a matter of time. The Germans, like the Gauls before them, would eventually be pacified. Their wild gods would be replaced by the Roman pantheon, their tribal laws superseded by the elegant logic of Roman jurisprudence, and their sons would be recruited to serve in the Roman army, their ferocity harnessed for the empire's own ends. The Romans saw the Germanic peoples through a lens of contemptuous fascination. They were described as giants, with fiery red or blonde hair, and eyes of a startling, piercing blue, a stark contrast to the Mediterranean peoples. They were fierce, yes, but also primitive. They lived in scattered wooden homesteads, not cities. They worshipped their gods in sacred groves, not in temples of stone. Their society was a chaotic tapestry of rival tribes, the Cherusci, the Marsi, the Chatti, the Bructeri, who fought amongst themselves as often as they fought outsiders. They were, in the Roman view, children, volatile, undisciplined, and incapable of the kind of unified, strategic thinking required to challenge the might of the empire. Rome's strategy was simple and proven: divide and conquer, pit one tribe against another, reward loyalty with gold and status, and punish defiance with overwhelming, terrifying force. This was the world Publius Quinctilius Varus was sent to govern in the year 7 AD. The final pacification of Germania was considered a foregone conclusion. The hardest fighting, it was believed, was over. The task now was one of administration, of transforming this wild frontier into a taxable, productive, and orderly part of the Roman machine. The legionaries stationed there, the 17th, the 18th, and the 19th, were no longer just an army of conquest, but an army of occupation. They were a visible, daily reminder of who was now in charge. Their presence was meant to intimidate, to overawe the local population into quiet submission. But the forest watched, and it remembered. It remembered the campaigns of Drusus, the villages put to the torch, the sacred trees cut down. It remembered the enslavement of its people and the arrogance of the invaders. The Romans believed they were taming a wilderness, but they failed to understand the soul of the people who lived within it. They mistook a lack of stone cities for a lack of civilization, a decentralized society for a lack of unity, and a temporary submission for a permanent surrender. The silence that had fallen over the German tribes was not the silence of acceptance. It was the silence of a predator holding its breath, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The Romans saw a frontier on the verge of being conquered. The Germans saw a homeland on the verge of being lost. And in that vast, shadowed forest, an ancient and powerful anger was beginning to coalesce, waiting for a leader, waiting for a spark, waiting for the moment when the unconquerable frontier would rise and devour the conquerors.
Into this simmering cauldron of resentment and silence walked Publius Quinctilius Varus. He was not a battle-hardened general forged on the frontiers, but a politician, an administrator, a man whose career had been built not in the chaos of the battlefield, but in the orderly corridors of power. He was immensely wealthy, connected by marriage to the imperial family itself, his wife. Claudia Pulchra was the grandniece of Emperor Augustus. This was a man who had never known failure, who had never had to doubt his own abilities or the manifest destiny of Rome. He saw the world as a ledger book, a series of problems to be solved with regulations, edicts, and the unwavering application of Roman law. Before Germania, Varus had been the governor of Syria, one of the wealthiest and most developed provinces in the entire empire. There, his methods had been brutally effective. When a messianic revolt broke out in Judea after the death of King Herod, Varus marched south with 2 legions and crushed the rebellion without mercy. He was said to have crucified 2,000 Jewish rebels, lining the roads with their bodies as a gruesome warning against future defiance. The act was not seen as particularly cruel by Roman standards. It was simply efficient. It was business. He left Syria even richer than he had arrived. His reputation secured as a man who could impose order and, more importantly, ensure the steady flow of taxes to the imperial treasury. This was the man Augustus chose for Germania. The appointment itself was a signal. The time for conquest, for the glory-seeking of generals like Drusus and Tiberius, was over. The time for administration had begun. Germania was to be treated not as a war zone, but as a province in Varus arrived at his summer headquarters at Aliso, near the Lippe River, with the mindset of a bureaucrat, not a warrior. He brought with him his staff of scribes, lawyers, and tax collectors. He saw the proud, independent Germanic chieftains not as kings of their own people, but as local magistrates who would now report to him. He saw their ancient tribal customs not as a valid social framework, but as a chaotic and primitive system that needed to be swept away and replaced by the superior, logical, and universal law of Rome. Varus's arrogance was not the boisterous pride of a soldier. It was a quiet, unshakable, almost serene conviction in his own cultural superiority. He could not conceive of a world where Roman law was not the ultimate good. He believed he was doing the Germans a favor. He was lifting them out of their barbaric ignorance and giving them the gifts of civilization: roads, courts, commerce, and peace, the Pax Romana. And for these gifts, it was only right that they should pay. He began to levy taxes, not in the form of tribute, like cattle or grain, which the Germans understood, but in silver, a currency that was scarce and alien to their largely barter-based economy. He summoned the chieftains to his camp to adjudicate their disputes, forcing them to stand before his tribunal like common petitioners. Their ancient traditions and oral laws dismissed with a wave of his hand in favor of complex Latin statutes. They could not read and did not comprehend to the Germanic warriors, whose culture was built on personal honor, loyalty, and the blood bond of the clan. This was a profound humiliation. Their leaders were being treated like servants. Their sacred customs were being mocked. Their freedom was being systematically dismantled, not by the sword, which they could understand and respect, but by the insidious creep of ink and parchment. Varus held court surrounded by his lictors, the symbols of Roman authority, their bundles of rods and axes, a constant silent threat of corporal and capital punishment. He would listen impatiently as translators struggled to convey the intricacies of a land dispute that had been handled by tribal elders for generations, only to issue a swift, unappealable verdict based on a paragraph from a Roman legal text. He was, in their eyes, a tyrant, but a passionless, condescending one, which was somehow worse. He didn't hate them, he simply didn't see them. They were merely an asset to be managed, a resource to be exploited. The Roman soldiers under his command, the legionaries of the 17th, 18th, and 19th, took their cue from their leader. Years of occupation had bred a casual contempt for the locals. They requisitioned food, demanded labor, and treated the German people with the dismissive authority of a master to a slave. They were the conquerors, living in fortified camps, whirled away from the people they were supposed to be governing. They saw the Germans as shifty, untrustworthy, and backward. They heard the whispers of resentment in the villages, saw the sullen, hateful stares, but dismissed them as the impotent anger of a broken people. They had defeated them in battle time and time again. What was there to fear now? Varus himself was utterly insulated from the reality of his province. He surrounded himself with men who told him what he wanted to hear. His inner circle was composed of Romans who shared his worldview, and a handful of loyal German nobles who had been granted Roman citizenship and privileges in exchange for their cooperation. These men, eager to maintain their favored status, assured Varus that the grumbling of the common folk was meaningless. They painted a picture of a province that was settling peacefully under his firm but fair rule. The greatest and most trusted of these German advisors was a handsome, charismatic young chieftain of the Cherusci tribe, a man who had been raised in Rome, who had served with distinction in the Roman army, and who spoke Latin as fluently as his native tongue. A man Varus considered not just an ally, but a friend. His name was Arminius, and as he sat at Varus's table, sharing wine and conversation, he listened to the governor's plans for the final Romanization of his homeland, and he smiled. Varus, in his supreme confidence, saw the smile of a loyal subject. He did not see the cold, calculating fury burning behind the young man's eyes. He was a man signing death warrants with every tax decree, digging his own grave with every legal judgment, utterly oblivious to the storm that was gathering just beyond the firelight of his camp. The iron fist of Rome was closing, but it was closing on air, while the true danger coiled unseen. In the very heart of his trust, if Publius Quinctilius Varus was the embodiment of Roman arrogance. The instrument of his downfall was the personification of Germanic vengeance hidden in plain sight. He was a man of two names, two worlds, and two souls warring within a single breast. To the Romans, he was Gaius Julius Arminius, a name that spoke of privilege and belonging. He was a Roman citizen, a status granted to only a select few conquered peoples. He was an equesinite, a member of the Roman equestrian order, a rank of distinction and honor. He wore the uniform of a Roman officer, a commander of Germanic auxiliary cavalry, and he wore it with an easy, practiced confidence. He spoke flawless, educated Latin, understood the nuances of Roman politics, and could navigate the complex social etiquette of a governor's dinner party as skillfully as he could guide a horse through a treacherous forest path. But his birth, name, the one whispered by his own people, was Armin. He was the son of Segmir, a chieftain of the noble house of the Cherusci, one of the most powerful and respected tribes in central Germania. He was a prince of the forests, his veins flowing with the blood of warriors who had resisted Roman encroachment for generations. Yet his life had been shaped by Rome's embrace grip that was both a privilege and a prison. As a boy, he had been given over to the Romans as a noble hostage, a common practice used by the empire to ensure the loyalty of conquered chieftains. It was a gilded cage. He was not mistreated. On the contrary, he was educated, trained, and groomed for a life of service to the empire. He was raised in Rome itself, where he witnessed firsthand the staggering power and glory of the capital of the world. He saw the Colosseum, the forums, the triumphant processions of victorious generals, and he learned the art of war, not in a German forest, but in Roman military academies. He served with distinction in the Roman army, fighting for the empire and the brutal Pannonian Revolt in the Balkans. There, under the command of the future Emperor Tiberius, he had proven his courage and his tactical brilliance. He had learned how the legions fought, their strengths and their weaknesses. He understood their discipline, their logistics, their reliance on open ground and clear lines of command. He learned to think like a Roman, to anticipate their strategies, to see the world through their eyes. He earned his citizenship and his knighthood on the battlefield, shedding blood for the very empire that held his homeland in subjugation. And this was the source of the profound, tearing conflict within him. One part of him was the Roman officer, who respected the order, the strength, and the civilization that Rome represented. He had Roman friends, had shared jokes and wine with fellow officers, and had felt the bond of camaraderie that comes from facing death together under the same standard. Yet, with every passing day, the other part of him, the Cheruscan prince, grew more dominant. When he returned to Germania in the entourage of Governor Varus, he saw his own people through new eyes. He saw the casual contempt of the Roman soldiers, the crushing weight of the new taxes, the slow, systematic erasure of his culture. He saw the proud faces of German warriors, men he had known since childhood, now lined with humiliation and quiet fury. He heard the stories of injustice, of land seized, of sacred groves desecrated.
The honor he had been granted by Rome now felt like a brand of shame. The citizenship felt like a collar. He was a living symbol of Rome's strategy of assimilation, a tamed barbarian meant to show his people the benefits of surrender. But every interaction with Varus, every condescending smile and patronizing piece of advice from the governor, chipped away at his Roman persona. Varus saw Arminius as his prized pupil, his loyal German, the perfect bridge between the two cultures. He would seat Arminius at his right hand during councils, seeking his advice on how to best manage the stubborn tribes. He trusted him implicitly, viewing his Roman education and military service as an absolute guarantee of his allegiance. Varus, the bureaucrat, could not comprehend the primal pull of blood, soil, and ancestry. He could not imagine that the identity forged in a German forest could be stronger than one bestowed by an imperial decree in Rome. NSO Arminius played his part, a masterful, agonizing performance. He was the perfect subordinate, respectful, intelligent, and efficient. He rode at the head of his auxiliary cavalry, his face a mask of calm authority, while his heart burned with a cold, calculated rage. He was a man living a double life in the most dangerous of circumstances. In the daylight hours, he was Varus's trusted advisor, helping to enforce Roman rule. But in the secrecy of night, under the cloak of the deep woods, he was something else entirely. He was becoming the center of a web of conspiracy, the unifying force that the scattered, bickering tribes had been desperately waiting for. He used his unique position, his intimate knowledge of both worlds, to weave a trap of breathtaking audacity. He was not merely a man torn between two identities. He was a man who had chosen to weaponize one identity to destroy the other. He would use the trust Rome had placed in him as the very tool of its annihilation. He was the prince of two worlds, and he had made his choice. He would sacrifice the Roman knight on the altar of the German warrior. While Varus held his courts and tallied his taxes in the false security of his summer camp, the real governance of Germania was taking place in the dead of night, far from Roman eyes and ears. The soul of the rebellion was not forged in a single, fiery moment of defiance, but kindled slowly, in whispers and shadows, in the sacred spaces hidden deep within the forest's embrace. These were the places the Romans could never find and would never understand. They were ancient clearings, places where the moonlight struggled to pierce the dense canopy, where monolithic stones bore witness to generations of tribal vows, or where a particularly ancient, gnarled oak tree was considered the living embodiment of a god. Here, under the silent gaze of their ancestral deities, the chieftains would gather. They came not as a unified army, but as a fractured and wary council of rivals. These were hard men, leaders of the Cherusci, the Marsi, the Chatti, and the Bructeri, whose peoples had fought each other for territory, for cattle, and for honor for as long as anyone could remember. Their faces, illuminated by the flickering, dancing light of a central bonfire, were maps of hardship and suspicion. They wore cloaks of wolfskin and bore the scars of old battles, many of them against each other. Trust did not come easily to them. In the beginning, the talk was of shared misery. One chieftain would speak of the new tax on grain, a burden that threatened his people with starvation come winter. Another would tell of a Roman patrol that had seized his daughter, her fate unknown. A third would recount the humiliation of standing before Varus's tribunal, his judgment dismissed like a child's complaint. Their voices were low, a mixture of guttural anger and weary despair. They spoke of the arrogance of the invaders, the endless demands, the slow strangulation of their way of life. There was a consensus of grievance, a shared hatred for the Roman yoke. But hatred alone was not a plan. For every warrior who spoke of open rebellion, another would counsel caution, his voice heavy with the memory of past defeats. They all remembered the legions of Drusus and Tiberius. They had seen what Roman discipline and steel could do to a frontal charge of brave but disorganized warriors. They had seen their villages burn and their fields salted. To challenge Rome openly was suicide, a glorious but futile gesture that would only bring more death and deeper subjugation. The spirit of resistance was there, a burning ember in the heart of every man present, but it was trapped beneath a heavy layer of fear and pragmatism. They were a people of immense courage, but they were not fools. They knew they were outmatched in open battle, and their history of infighting made any prospect of a truly unified front seem like a distant dream. Into this circle of doubt and simmering rage stepped Arminius. When he arrived, a palpable tension filled the clearing. He was one of them, the son of a great Cheruscan chieftain, yet he wore the ghost of Rome about him. He had served the enemy, accepted their honors, and spoken their tongue. To some, he was a collaborator, a man tainted by his proximity to the oppressors. They watched him with narrowed, suspicious eyes, their hands never far from the hilts of their long knives. Nbut Arminius did not speak like a Roman. He spoke to them in their own tongue, his words resonating with the shared rhythm of their ancestors. He did not speak of glory or of hopeless, heroic charges. He spoke with the cold, precise logic he had learned in the Roman military academies, but he used it to dissect Roman vulnerabilities. He stood before the fire, his face half in shadow, half in light, and he laid bare the weaknesses of the machine they all thought was invincible. He spoke of the legions' arrogance, their overconfidence, their utter dependence on supply lines and clear roads. He explained how their strength, their tight, disciplined formations, was also their greatest weakness in the suffocating terrain of the forest. NHE did not ask them to unite as one people under a single king. He knew their rivalries ran too deep. Instead, he appealed to their shared desire for vengeance and their warriors' pride. He did not propose a war, he proposed a hunt, an ambush, a single, decisive blow that would not just defeat the Romans but annihilate them. He used his intimate knowledge of Varus's character, painting a picture of a vain, complacent governor who could be easily led, easily deceived. His plan was not a vague call to arms. It was a detailed, step-by-step blueprint for a massacre. NHE spoke to each chieftain, acknowledging their old grievances, showing respect for their counsel, and weaving their desires into his larger strategy. To the Marsi, who knew the western forests better than anyone, he assigned the role of scouts. To the Brocteri, known for their ferocity, he promised the honor of the first strike. He made them all feel that this was their plan, their vengeance. He was not a king giving orders. He was the sharp, intelligent edge of their collective rage. Slowly, night after night, in secret meetings across the land, the whispers of despair began to transform into the low, determined murmur of conspiracy. The old rivalries were not forgotten, but they were set aside, superseded by a greater hatred. Arminius, the man of two worlds, was forging a weapon in the dark. He was taking the fractured, resentful pieces of the Germanic tribes and binding them together with a single, unifying purpose: the utter and complete destruction of the 3 legions of Publius Quinctilius Varus. The fire in their eyes began to change from one of sullen anger to one of predatory focus. The trap was being set. The most critical battle in Arminius's war was not one of swords and spears, but one of perception and trust. It was fought not in the mud of the forest, but in the warm, firelit comfort of Governor Varus's own tent. Here, the Cheruscan prince waged a campaign of psychological warfare with a subtlety and patience that was nothing short of masterful. His every action, every word, every gesture was a carefully calibrated piece of a grand deception designed to reinforce the one fatal weakness in the Roman armor: Varus's unshakable belief in his own judgment. Arminius did not simply feign loyalty, he embodied it. He became the most diligent, the most helpful, the most indispensable of all the governor's native advisors. He would arrive at Varus's councils early and stay late, his brow furrowed with concentration as he listened to the driest of administrative details. He offered insightful advice on managing the notoriously stubborn tribes, often suggesting a course of action that seemed firm but fair, lulling Varus into believing that the process of Romanization was proceeding exactly as planned. He would translate the complaints of minor chieftains, subtly framing them as petty squabbles that affirmed the need for Roman arbitration rather than as symptoms of a deeper, more dangerous discontent. NTHE dinners were the main stage for his performance. Varus, a man who enjoyed the comforts of his station, would often host lavish meals for his inner circle. There, amidst the clatter of silver plates and the free-flowing wine, Arminius would play the part of the grateful, civilized subject. He would engage the Roman officers in conversation about their campaigns in Pannonia, sharing stories of their shared military past, forging bonds of false camaraderie. He would laugh at Varus's heavy-handed jokes, his laughter never sounding forced. He would raise his cup and toast to the health of the Emperor Augustus and the eternal glory of Rome, his eyes betraying not a flicker of the venom in his heart. NHE became Varus's shadow, a constant, reassuring presence. When Varus inspected the troops, Arminius was at his side. When Varus reviewed tax receipts, Arminius was there to explain the complexities of the local economy. He used his position as commander of the German auxiliary cavalry to feed Varus a steady stream of carefully curated intelligence. He would report on the movements of various tribes, exaggerating their rivalries, making it seem as though they were more likely to attack each other than to ever unite against Rome. He would stage raids on Roman supply lines by his own conspirators, which his own cavalry would then heroically drive off, further cementing his reputation as a loyal and effective commander. He was solving problems that he himself had created. This performance was a terrible, lonely burden. To sit at the table of the man you have sworn to destroy, to share his bread and wine, to accept his friendship while meticulously planning his annihilation, required a level of self-control that was almost inhuman. Every smile was a lie. Every piece of advice was a thread in a slowly tightening noose. He had to listen to the Romans speak of his own people with casual disdain, calling them savages and barbarians, and he had to nod in agreement. He had to endure Varus's patronizing praise, the governor clapping him on the back and calling him "my German," a living testament to Rome's civilizing influence. Perhaps the most agonizing part was the genuine affection Varus seemed to hold for him. The Roman governor was not a monster in his own mind. He was a mentor, and he saw in Arminius a reflection of his own success. He truly believed he was guiding this bright young man towards a great future within the Roman world. Arminius, in turn, was studying his prey. He learned Varus's habits, his vanities, his blind spots. He saw that Varus was a man who trusted routine, who believed in the orderly progression of things. The governor's entire worldview was based on the assumption that the world operated on logical, predictable principles, Roman principles. The idea of a betrayal so profound, so personal, from a man he had elevated and trusted so completely, was simply outside the realm of his imagination. It was a failure of intellect, a failure of empathy, and a failure of cultural understanding. Varus saw Arminius the Roman knight, because that is what he wanted to see. He was utterly blind to Armin the Cheruscan warrior, who was patiently waiting for the moment to strike. The friendship was a lie, the loyalty a phantom. It was the most crucial part of the trap, a weapon forged not of iron, but of intimacy and trust. And it was being aimed directly at the heart of Roman power in Germania. The most critical battle in Arminius's war was not one of swords and spears, but one of perception and trust. It was fought not in the mud of the forest, but in the warm, firelit comfort of Governor Varus's own tent. Here, the Cheruscan prince waged a campaign of psychological warfare with a subtlety and patience that was nothing short of masterful. His every action, every word, every gesture was a carefully calibrated piece of a grand deception designed to reinforce the one fatal weakness in the Roman armor: Varus's unshakable belief in his own judgment. Arminius did not simply feign loyalty, he embodied it. He became the most diligent, the most helpful, the most indispensable of all the governor's native advisors. He would arrive at Varus's councils early and stay late, his brow furrowed with concentration as he listened to the driest of administrative details. He offered insightful advice on managing the notoriously stubborn tribes, often suggesting a course of action that seemed firm but fair, lulling Varus into believing that the process of Romanization was proceeding exactly as planned. He would translate the complaints of minor chieftains, subtly framing them as petty squabbles that affirmed the need for Roman arbitration rather than as symptoms of a deeper, more dangerous discontent. NTHE dinners were the main stage for his performance. Varus, a man who enjoyed the comforts of his station, would often host lavish meals for his inner circle. There, amidst the clatter of silver plates and the free-flowing wine, Arminius would play the part of the grateful, civilized subject. He would engage the Roman officers in conversation about their campaigns in Pannonia, sharing stories of their shared military past, forging bonds of false camaraderie. He would laugh at Varus's heavy-handed jokes, his laughter never sounding forced. He would raise his cup and toast to the health of the Emperor Augustus and the eternal glory of Rome, his eyes betraying not a flicker of the venom in his heart. NHE became Varus's shadow, a constant, reassuring presence. When Varus inspected the troops, Arminius was at his side. When Varus reviewed tax receipts, Arminius was there to explain the complexities of the local economy. He used his position as commander of the German auxiliary cavalry to feed Varus a steady stream of carefully curated intelligence. He would report on the movements of various tribes, exaggerating their rivalries, making it seem as though they were more likely to attack each other than to ever unite against Rome. He would stage raids on Roman supply lines by his own conspirators, which his own cavalry would then heroically drive off, further cementing his reputation as a loyal and effective commander. He was solving problems that he himself had created. This performance was a terrible, lonely burden. To sit at the table of the man you have sworn to destroy, to share his bread and wine, to accept his friendship while meticulously planning his annihilation, required a level of self-control that was almost inhuman. Every smile was a lie. Every piece of advice was a thread in a slowly tightening noose. He had to listen to the Romans speak of his own people with casual disdain, calling them savages and barbarians, and he had to nod in agreement. He had to endure Varus's patronizing praise, the governor clapping him on the back and calling him "my German," a living testament to Rome's civilizing influence. Perhaps the most agonizing part was the genuine affection Varus seemed to hold for him. The Roman governor was not a monster in his own mind. He was a mentor, and he saw in Arminius a reflection of his own success. He truly believed he was guiding this bright young man towards a great future within the Roman world. Arminius, in turn, was studying his prey. He learned Varus's habits, his vanities, his blind spots. He saw that Varus was a man who trusted routine, who believed in the orderly progression of things. The governor's entire worldview was based on the assumption that the world operated on logical, predictable principles, Roman principles. The idea of a betrayal so profound, so personal, from a man he had elevated and trusted so completely, was simply outside the realm of his imagination. It was a failure of intellect, a failure of empathy, and a failure of cultural understanding. Varus saw Arminius the Roman knight because that is what he wanted to see. He was utterly blind to Armin the Cheruscan warrior, who was patiently waiting for the moment to strike. The friendship was a lie, the loyalty a phantom. It was the most crucial part of the trap, a weapon forged not of iron, but of intimacy and trust, and it was being aimed directly at the heart of Roman power in Germania. The command was given. The great beast, the Roman war machine, stirred itself from its summer slumber and began to move. This was not merely an army, it was a city on the march. At its heart were the legions, the 17th, the 18th, and the 19th. Over 15,000 fighting men, the best equipped and most disciplined soldiers in the world. Each legionary was a walking fortress, clad in segmented iron armor, lorica segmentata, and carrying the iconic rectangular shield, the scutum. They bore the short, stabbing sword, the gladius, and two heavy-throwing javelins, the pila, designed to bend on impact, rendering an enemy's shield useless. They were a river of polished iron and red tunics, a spectacle of imperial power designed to awe and intimidate. NBUT, they were not alone. With them came thousands of auxiliary troops, soldiers recruited from the conquered provinces, including the very Germanic cavalry units that had just ridden off with Arminius. And trailing behind this military corps was a vast, sprawling tale of humanity, the baggage train. This was a chaotic, lumbering procession of heavy wagons, pulled by straining mules and oxen. They carried everything the army needed to function: tents, tools, forges, grinding stones for flour, medical supplies, and the personal wealth of the officers. And with the wagons came the people. Thousands of civilian camp followers whose lives were tied to the legions. Wives and children of the soldiers, merchants, artisans, servants, and slaves. They were a vulnerable, soft underbelly attached to the hard shell of the army. NTHE column, when stretched out on the march, was a terrifyingly fragile thing. It was a serpent of men and material that snaked for miles, perhaps as many as 10 or 12 from head to tail. On the open, paved military roads of Gaul or Italy, this was manageable. Scouts could see for miles, flanks could be protected, and if attacked, the column could quickly coil into a defensive posture, the legionaries forming an impenetrable wall of shields and steel. But here, on the edge of the Teutoburg Forest, the road ended. Before them lay a landscape that was the antithesis of Roman order. They left the familiar world behind and plunged into the shadows. The transition was stark and immediate. One moment, they were under the wide open sky. The next, they were swallowed by the trees. The great ancient oaks and beeches formed a dense, suffocating canopy that immediately dimmed the autumn light, casting the entire column into a perpetual twilight. The air grew colder, heavier, thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. Sound died in the oppressive stillness. The familiar, rhythmic tramp of thousands of hobnailed sandals, the caligay, was muffled by the soft, mossy ground. The shouted commands of the centurions seemed to lose their authority, swallowed by the immense, indifferent silence of the woods. NFOR the soldiers, men recruited from the sunny hills of Italy and the open plains of Spain, this was an alien and deeply unsettling environment. The forest pressed in on all sides, a solid wall of green and brown. There were no sightlines, no clear fields of fire. An ambush could come from any direction, at any moment. Every gnarled tree looked like a hiding place. Every dark thicket, a potential staging ground for an attack. The legionaries, trained for open battle, gripped their javelins tighter, their eyes scanning the impenetrable gloom. A sense of claustrophobia, of being watched by unseen eyes, began to creep through the ranks. The confidence they felt on the parade ground began to curdle into a low, simmering anxiety. The forest itself felt like a conscious, malevolent entity, and they were trespassers in a sacred, hostile domain. Varus, riding near the head of the column, saw only a logistical challenge. His men saw a tomb in the making. They were marching deeper and deeper into the maw of the trap, and with every step, the jaws were beginning to close behind them. As if the land itself had sided with the conspirators, the sky turned against the Romans. On the second day of the march, the heavens broke. This was not a gentle autumn shower. It was a furious, violent deluge, a torrential downpour that seemed to spring from the very anger of the Germanic gods. The sky, already gray and oppressive under the forest canopy, turned a bruised, near-black color. A cold, relentless wind began to howl through the treetops, tearing at the legionary standards and whipping cloaks into faces. The sound was deafening. A constant roar of wind and water that drowned out commands and turned the world into a churning chaos of the elements. NTHE rain fell in blinding sheets, transforming the narrow, uneven forest path into a river of mud. The ground, already soft and spongy, lost all integrity. It became a thick, greedy quagmire that sucked at the feet of the soldiers and the wheels of the wagons. Every step became a struggle. The heavily laden legionaries, each carrying over 60 pounds of armor and equipment, found their hobnailed sandals slipping and sliding, offering no purchase. Men stumbled and fell, their armor filling with cold, filthy water. The carefully ordered marching lines, the pride of the legions, began to break apart. devolving into a ragged, struggling procession of exhausted individuals. NTHE's situation was even worse for the baggage train. The heavy wagons, laden with thousands of pounds of supplies, sank up to their axles in the sucking mud. Mules and oxen, their eyes wide with panic, strained against their harnesses, their hooves finding no traction, until they were hopelessly bogged down. The long, vulnerable column began to stretch and fracture. Gaps appeared, hundreds of yards long, separating the fighting cohorts from one another and from their vital supplies. The army was becoming disjointed, a series of isolated pockets of men struggling against a hostile environment, losing all cohesion and mutual support. NTO moved forward, the legionaries were forced to become pioneers. They had to lay down their shields and take up axes, hacking at the tangled undergrowth, felling trees to create makeshift corduroy roads over the worst of the swamps. It was exhausting, back-breaking work, performed in the pouring rain by men who were already cold, soaked, and demoralized. Their armor became a cold, heavy burden, and the constant physical exertion drained their strength. They were no longer proud conquerors. They were miserable, mud-caked laborers, fighting a losing battle against the terrain itself. NTHE's storm was Arminius's greatest unforeseen ally. It accomplished what no Germanic force could have done on its own. It completely neutralized the Romans' greatest strengths. The rain soaked their composite bows, rendering the archers useless. It plastered their large leather shields, making them heavy and waterlogged. Most importantly, it shattered their discipline and their formation. The legions were no longer a cohesive fighting unit. They were a disorganized, exhausted, and strung-out mob, perfectly vulnerable, spread thin over miles of the most difficult terrain imaginable. The storm washed away their confidence, their order, and their strength, leaving them exposed and ready for the slaughter. The sky wept for what was to come, and the rain fell like tears on the doomed men below, each drop a prelude to the torrent of blood that was about to be unleashed. It came from nowhere, and it came from everywhere at once. For a moment, the only enemy was the mud and the rain. The world was a miserable cacophony of wind, thunder, and the curses of exhausted men. Then a new sound sliced through the storm. It was not the sound of nature. It was a sharp, piercing whistle, the sound of a heavy object cutting through the wet air at incredible speed. The sound was followed almost instantly by a dull, wet thump and a strangled cry. Near the head of the column, a Roman standard-bearer, an aquilifer clutching the silver eagle of his legion, staggered. A long, heavy javelin protruded from his chest, its iron tip having punched clean through his armor. He stood for a second, a look of utter shock on his face, the sacred eagle wavering in his grasp, before he collapsed face down into the mud. NTHE's single javelin was the overture to hell. Before the Romans around the fallen standard-bearer could even process what had happened, the forest erupted. From the high ground on their left, from the dense, dark woods on their right, a sound arose that would haunt the nightmares of any survivor. It was the Berytus, the Germanic war cry. It was not a simple shout, but a terrifying, rising roar, starting as a low growl and swelling into a deafening, unified chorus of pure, unadulterated fury. The sound seemed to come from thousands of throats, an avalanche of hate that rolled down the hillsides and crashed over the stunned Roman column. It was the collective voice of the forest, the rage of a people whose patience had finally broken. And immediately, the air was filled with projectiles. It was not a coordinated volley in the Roman style, but a chaotic, unceasing storm of death. Heavy, fire-hardened wooden spears, long iron-tipped javelins, and sharpened stones hurled from slings rained down on the legionaries. The missiles came from above, plunging down at a steep angle that made their large shields, the scuta, awkward and ineffective. Men screamed as javelins pierced shoulders and thighs, the exposed parts of their bodies. The sound of iron points clanging against helmets and breastplates was incessant, a deadly percussion accompanying the roar of the storm and the cries of the warriors. NTHE Romans were caught completely, utterly by surprise. Their training, their discipline, their entire military doctrine was for naught. There was no enemy to charge, no battle line to form. The foe was a phantom, hidden in the trees and the fog, visible only in fleeting glimpses. A flash of a wild-eyed face, a muscular arm hurling a spear, a figure disappearing back into the gloom. The attack was designed to create maximum chaos and terror, and it succeeded beyond measure. In panic, the most corrosive of all battlefield emotions began to spread like a virus. The soldiers, strung out and exhausted, had no senior officers nearby to give them orders. Centurions bellowed commands that were lost in the din, trying to rally their men into some semblance of a defensive formation. But how could they form a line in a narrow, muddy track, hemmed in by impenetrable forest on both sides? How could they form a testudo, the famous tortoise formation, when the attack was coming from all directions and the ground beneath their feet was a sucking mire? NTHE first few minutes were a blur of shock and confusion. Legionaries huddled together in small, desperate groups, raising their shields against the storm of projectiles, peering into the dark woods from which their death was coming. They were the greatest soldiers in the world, but they were fighting an enemy they couldn't see, in a place that was actively trying to kill them. The orderly, confident column of a few hours before had been shattered. In its place was a series of isolated, terrified pockets of men, trapped in a miles-long corridor of mud and death. The first javelin had not just killed a man, it had pierced the heart of the legions. Invincibility. The hunt had begun. The initial storm of projectiles was only the beginning, a brutal overture designed to sow terror and confusion. Now, the forest itself seemed to come alive, disgorging the warriors it had concealed. They did not attack in disciplined lines like the Romans. They swarmed. From the high ground to the left of the Roman column, a position of immense tactical advantage, the Germanic warriors charged. They came hurtling down the muddy slopes, using a controlled slide that their bare feet or simple leather shoes could manage far better than the Romans, hobnailed sandals. They moved with a terrifying, fluid agility, perfectly at home in this chaotic environment. These were men who had been born in these woods, who had hunted here since they were boys. They were large, physically imposing figures, many fighting bare-chested despite the cold and rain, their bodies painted with fearsome symbols. They carried heavy wooden shields, often brightly painted, and wielded a variety of deadly weapons. The most common was the framia, a short, light spear with a narrow, razor-sharp iron tip, which they used with lethal skill for both throwing and for close-quarter stabbing. Others carried long swords, heavy battle axes that could split a Roman helmet, or crude but effective clubs. They were a vision from a Roman soldier's nightmare, wild, seemingly fearless, and utterly ferocious. They crashed into the stretched-out, disorganized Roman flank like a tidal wave. The legionaries, struggling to keep their footing in the mud, tried to form a shield wall, the bedrock of their defensive tactics. But the narrowness of the path and the uneven ground made a cohesive wall impossible. The Germans did not meet it head-on. They flowed around the small, desperate clusters of Roman soldiers, seeking gaps, isolating groups of 2 or 3 legionaries, and overwhelming them with sheer numbers and ferocity. NTHE fighting was brutal, intimate, and horrifying. This was not the clean, orderly battle of the open field. This was a desperate, muddy brawl for survival. The Romans' primary weapon, the pilum, was largely useless here. There was no space to throw it effectively, and it was too unwieldy for the close-in fighting. They drew their gladii, the short swords that were so deadly in the press of a major battle, but here they were often outnumbered, fighting enemies who were stronger and more agile in the treacherous conditions. A Roman soldier, weighed down by his armor and exhausted from the march, would find himself beset by 2 or 3 Germans, their axes and spears probing for any weakness in his defense. NTHE sounds were of a slaughterhouse. The wet crunch of an axe biting into a helmet, the sharp crack of a shield splitting, the grunts of exertion, and the high, piercing screams of men dying in agony. The Germans, fueled by generations of resentment, fought with a savage glee. They leaped from behind trees, their war cries startling the already terrified Romans. They used the terrain with deadly intelligence, appearing on a high bank to hurl a spear before melting back into the woods, only to reappear a few yards down the path to strike again. NFOR the legionaries. It was a sensory overload of terror. The enemy was everywhere. The rain was relentless. The mud was an anchor, pulling them down. Their comrades were falling all around them, their red tunics turning a darker shade of crimson as their blood mixed with the rain and the dirt. The disciplined formations that had conquered the world were reduced to a chaotic scrum of individual duels. The Roman system of war, a system based on order, cohesion, and mutual support, had been completely dismantled. Here, in the dark heart of the Teutoburg Forest, every man was alone, fighting his own desperate and often final battle. In the midst of the unfolding chaos, as the Roman legionaries fought desperately against the phantoms in the forest, there was still a flicker of hope. It rested with the cavalry. The mounted auxiliary units, composed largely of Gallic and Germanic horsemen, were the eyes, ears, and mobile striking force of the army. Their role in a situation like this was critical: to protect the vulnerable flanks of the column, to charge and disperse any concentrated group of attackers, and to provide a screen behind which the infantry could attempt to regroup. At the head of these vital units was the man Varus still believed to be his most loyal ally. Arminius and The Roman commanders, wherever they could make themselves heard above the roar of the storm and battle, would have been screaming for the cavalry to engage. They would have been looking to the flanks, expecting to see the familiar sight of their allied horsemen charging down the slopes, scattering the tribal warriors, and relieving the pressure on the beleaguered infantry. For a few crucial, desperate moments, the legionaries held on, believing that help was on its way, that the disciplined cavalry under the command of the trusted Arminius would soon turn the tide. The help that came was not what they expected. On the right flank of the Roman column, where the terrain was slightly more open, the auxiliary cavalry finally appeared. They came charging out of the woods, a thunder of hooves against the wet earth. But they were not charging towards the attacking Germanic tribesmen. They were charging directly into the exposed flank of the Roman infantry. The moment of realization must have been one of pure, mind-shattering horror. The faces under the helmets were not those of Gauls or Thracians, but of their own German auxiliaries. At their head, his face a mask of cold, triumphant fury, was Arminius. The man who had dined with Varus, the man who had sworn allegiance to the emperor, the man who had guided them into this trap, was now leading the charge against them. His sword, a Roman spatha given to him by the very army he was now destroying, rose and fell, cutting down the soldiers who had, only hours before, considered him their comrade and commander. This was the true masterstroke of the betrayal. It was not just a physical attack, it was a psychological dagger plunged into the heart of the Roman column. The trust that had been the foundation of Varus's entire strategy was revealed as a catastrophic lie in the most brutal way imaginable. The defenders became the attackers. The guardians became the executioners. The last glimmer of hope was extinguished and replaced with the chilling certainty of absolute doom. The impact of the cavalry charge was devastating. The horsemen smashed into the already disorganized legionaries, their momentum irresistible. They trampled men underfoot, their lances and swords finding easy targets among the shocked and confused infantry. The Roman soldiers, who had been facing outwards to fight the attackers from the forest, were now hit from their flank and rear. They were caught in a deadly crossfire, a hopeless position from which there was no escape. The last vestiges of formation dissolved completely. It was no longer a battle, it was a rout, a massacre taking place in a muddy, inescapable corridor. Arminius was the center of the storm, a whirlwind of vengeance. He was no longer the civilized Roman knight. He was Armin, the Cheruscan prince, reclaiming his people's honor with every Roman he cut down. His personal betrayal was the signal for all the other loyal German units embedded within the Roman column to turn. Chieftains, who had been marching alongside Roman officers, suddenly drew their hidden weapons and attacked the men next to them. The betrayal was total, intimate, and absolute. The Roman army did not just face an external enemy. It was now consuming itself from within. For Varus, wherever he was in the chaos, the sight of Arminius leading the charge against him would have been a blow more fatal than any sword thrust. It was the moment he knew, with sickening certainty, that all was lost. Somewhere in the heart of the maelstrom, surrounded by his personal bodyguard and staff, was Publius Quinctilius Varus. For him, the unfolding disaster was not just a tactical defeat, it was the utter demolition of his entire world. This was a man whose life had been defined by order, predictability, and the serene assurance of Roman superiority. The chaos erupting around him was not something his mind was equipped to process. The roar of the Germanic war cries, the sight of his disciplined legionaries being cut down in the mud, the relentless, cold rain. It was all a nightmarish affront to the logical, structured universe he inhabited. NBUT, the most devastating blow, was not the ambush itself. It was the betrayal. The sight of Arminius, his protege, his trusted advisor, his friend, leading a cavalry charge against his own flank was a psychological wound from which he could not recover. It was a moment of such profound personal treason that it shattered his reality. Every conversation they had shared, every piece of advice he had taken, every shared cup of wine now replayed in his mind as a bitter, humiliating mockery. He had not just been defeated, he had been played. His trust, his judgment, his perception of his own intelligence. All of it had been a tool in the hands of the man he had dismissed as a civilized barbarian. In this critical moment, when his men desperately needed a leader, Varus was paralyzed. The Roman military system was designed to be a top-down hierarchy. The legionaries and centurions were trained to execute orders, not to improvise grand strategy. They looked to their legates and, ultimately, to their commanding general for direction. They needed a plan, a command to form a defensive square in order to punch through the enemy line in a specific direction, a strategy to fight their way to clear ground. They needed the calm, authoritative voice of their commander to cut through the panic and restore a semblance of order. NBUT, no such orders came. Varus, overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the catastrophe and the personal sting of the betrayal, seemed to shrink into himself. The reports that came to him from frantic messengers would have painted a picture of utter disintegration. The 19th Legion, at the head of the column, was being cut to pieces. The baggage train was being overrun, the civilian followers slaughtered. The 18th Legion, in the center, was being attacked from all sides. The 17th, guarding the rear, was desperately trying to fight off warriors emerging from the woods behind them. The entire army, stretched over miles, was being systematically dismembered. NHI's mind, accustomed to solving problems with edicts and legal statutes, could not grasp the brutal, fluid reality of the situation. He was a bureaucrat in a butcher's yard. The skills that had served him so well in the governor's palace in Syria were utterly useless here. He could not issue a decree to make the rain stop. He could not file a motion to have the Germans cease their attack. He was trapped in a situation that defied all the rules he lived by. NHI's officers would have screamed at him for orders, their faces streaked with rain and blood, their voices hoarse with desperation. "What are your commands, General? What do we do?" But Varus, his face pale with shock, could offer nothing. The Roman legions, the most formidable fighting force on earth, were rendered headless. Their strength was not just in their arms and armor, but in their cohesion and their command structure. With their commander psychologically broken, that structure crumbled. The paralysis at the top cascaded downwards, turning every man into an island, fighting for his own survival. Varus's personal failure of imagination, his inability to see beyond his own arrogance, was now being paid for in the blood of thousands of his men. He had led them into this tomb, and now, frozen by the horror of his own making, he could not show them the way out. As the gray, watery daylight began to fail, the fury of the German attack subsided. They did not retreat, they simply melted back into the darkening forest, their bloodlust sated for the moment. They were masters of this terrain and this climate, and they knew the night, with its cold and its terror, would be an enemy to the Romans just as potent as any warrior. For the shattered remnants of the three legions, the coming of darkness brought no relief, only a different kind of horror. They were alive, but they were trapped, wounded, and surrounded by an unseen enemy. And under the frantic, bellowed commands of the few surviving centurions and junior officers who had kept their nerve, the Romans attempted to do the one thing their training demanded in such a situation. They began to build a camp. It was a desperate, almost pathetic imitation of the magnificent fortified marching camps they were famous for. There was no time to survey the land, no opportunity to select a strong defensive position. They were forced to make their stand where the fighting had stopped, in the middle of the muddy, corpse-strewn track. Using the axes and shovels they carried, the exhausted legionaries began the back-breaking work. They dug a shallow, waterlogged ditch and threw up a crude earthen rampart, reinforcing it with felled trees and anything else they could find. Broken wagons, baggage, even the bodies of their own dead comrades. It was a grim, frantic task, performed in the deepening gloom and the unceasing, miserable rain. The men worked in a state of shell-shocked silence, their movements mechanical, their faces blank with trauma, The ground was littered with the dead and dying. The air was thick with the groans of the wounded, a sound that was almost more terrible than the war cries that had preceded it. This was a fortified camp of fear. It was not a base for future operations, it was a temporary shield against the inevitable. As darkness became absolute, the true psychological terror began. The Romans were huddled together in the mud and the cold, their armor a clammy, chilling weight. They had little food and no dry clothing. The wounded lay in agony, their injuries tended to by frantic comrades with no medical supplies. As the baggage train had been lost, many would not survive the night, succumbing to their wounds, the cold, or the sheer shock. And from the darkness beyond their flimsy barricade, the sounds began. The Germans were close, encamped all around them, their presence a constant, suffocating pressure. The Romans could see the flickering of hundreds, perhaps thousands, of enemy campfires through the trees, pinpricks of light that served as a reminder of their encirclement. And they could hear them. They heard the triumphant, guttural shouts, the victory chants that echoed through the forest. They heard the sounds of feasting and drinking as the Germans celebrated with the captured Roman supplies, their voices filled with mockery. Worst of all were the sounds of torture. The Germans had taken many prisoners during the day's fighting, and they now began their grim work within earshot of the Roman camp. The legionaries were forced to listen to the agonized screams of their captured friends and comrades, a deliberate act of psychological warfare designed to break their spirit completely. They heard the ritualistic chants of Germanic priests and the sickening thud of axes, and they knew that their captured comrades were being sacrificed to the German gods in thanks for the victory. It was a night without sleep, a night of listening to the sounds of hell just beyond a thin wall of earth and wood. Every Roman soldier in that camp knew, with a cold, leaden certainty, that the same fate awaited them if they were captured. Survival was no longer about victory, it was about escaping the horrific, ritualistic death that awaited them in the dark heart of this forest. The dawn of the second day brought no hope, only a gray, weeping sky and a clearer view of the devastation. The makeshift camp was a tableau of misery. The ground was a churned morass of mud and blood. The bodies of those who had died from their wounds during the night lay where they had fallen. The survivors, their faces gaunt and etched with the trauma of what they had seen and heard, were hollow-eyed shells of the proud soldiers they had once been. They were cold, starving, and haunted. But to stay was to die. Their only conceivable chance, however slim, was to move, to try and break out of the encirclement and reach the safety of the Roman fort at Aliso, which they believed to be 2 days' march away. A terrible decision was made, born of brutal necessity. There could be no more baggage. The remaining wagons, the officers, personal belongings, the tents, the heavy equipment, everything that was not essential for fighting, had to be abandoned. The wagons were smashed and burned, the smoke coiling up into the damp air. A funeral pyre for the legions, pride and a clear signal to the watching Germans that the Romans were preparing to flee. Even more terrible decision followed. The wounded who could not walk on their own had to be left behind. It was the most brutal calculation of military survival, a choice that went against the powerful Roman ethos of comradeship. There were no resources to carry them, and their presence would slow the column to a crawl, dooming everyone. The scenes of parting were agonizing. Men were forced to leave their friends, their brothers in arms, lying in the mud, giving them a final drink of water or a last, desperate word of encouragement. They left them with the full knowledge that they were abandoning them to certain death and mutilation at the hands of the enemy. It was an act of profound shame and sorrow, a wound to the very soul of the legions, and the faces of the men they left behind would haunt them for the rest of their short lives. NTHE column that formed up to leave the camp was a shadow of its former self. It was smaller, leaner, and stripped of all its imperial grandeur. It was now purely a military force, but a broken one. The men shuffled into a semblance of a marching formation, their movements stiff from cold and exhaustion. They raised their heavy, waterlogged shields and began to move out, a stumbling, desperate flight. NTHE Germans were waiting. They had allowed the Romans to form up and begin their march, deliberately letting them move out into the open track before renewing their assault. The attacks on the second day were different. They were less about shock and awe and more about a relentless, grinding attrition. The warriors no longer needed to charge with wild ferocity. They could now pick off the Romans at their leisure. They harried the column from all sides, darting out from the trees to hurl a javelin or an axe at the struggling lines before melting back into the forest. It was a moving gauntlet of death. The Romans were forced to march and fight simultaneously, a physically and mentally exhausting ordeal. They could not stop to rest. They could not stop to properly engage the enemy, who refused to meet them in a pitched battle. They could only trudge forward through the seemingly endless mud, their heads bowed against the rain, their shields raised against a death that could come from any direction at any moment. Men would cry out and fall, and the column would have to march on, leaving their bodies to be swarmed by the triumphant Germans. The path behind them became a gruesome trail of the dead and dying, a testament to their agonizingly slow disintegration. The hope of reaching Aliso was a fading ember, and with every step, with every fallen comrade, the cold, wet darkness of the forest seemed to press in closer, promising only more pain and more loss. The Roman legion was more than just a collection of soldiers. It was a finely tuned system, a pyramid of command where every man knew his place and his duty. At its base was the legionary, trained to obey without question. Above him was the decanus, the leader of his 10-man tent group. Above him, the centurion, the tough, professional backbone of the army, identified by the transverse crest on his helmet. Above the centurions were the senior tribunes and the camp prefect, and at the very apex, the legate, the general, whose will directed the entire organism. This rigid, unbreakable chain of command was the source of the legion's legendary discipline. It was what allowed them to function as a single, cohesive entity in the chaos of battle. And on the second day of the retreat, the Germans made it their primary objective to shatter that chain. German warriors, guided by the intimate knowledge of Arminius, began to specifically target the Roman officers. They were easy to identify. The centurions with their distinctive helmets and their vitus, the vine staff symbol of their rank, the tribunes in their more ornate armor, the standard bearers, the signifers and aquilifers, whose loss would have a devastating impact on morale. The Germans, masters of skirmish warfare, would wait for an officer to expose himself, perhaps moving along the line to rally his men, and then unleash a concentrated volley of javelins. One by one, the leaders began to fall. A centurion, bellowing encouragement to his century, would suddenly clutch at his throat, a spear point emerging from his gorget. A tribune, trying to direct a defensive maneuver, would be struck from his horse. The loss of each officer was a devastating blow. When a centurion fell, he took with him decades of battlefield experience. He was the man his soldiers looked to for guidance, the one who knew how to keep them steady in a crisis. When he was gone, his century, his unit of 80 men, would begin to lose its cohesion, its movements becoming hesitant and confused. Communication, that was the lifeblood of the army, broke down completely. In the roar of the storm and the constant harassment of the attacks, it was impossible for the senior commanders who were still alive to pass orders down the miles-long column. The trumpeters, whose horn calls relayed commands over the noise of battle, were also targeted and silenced. The army was going deaf and dumb. Each cohort, each century, became an isolated entity, cut off from the rest, forced to fight its own private war for survival, with no knowledge of the larger situation. This systematic assassination of the command structure had a catastrophic effect on the morale of the common soldiers. They felt abandoned, leaderless. The system they had trusted their entire lives was disintegrating before their very eyes. The familiar faces of authority were gone, replaced by the bodies of their officers lying in the mud. Panic, which had been held at bay by the force of discipline, began to take over. The retreat devolved from a desperate but organized military action into a stumbling, panicked flight. Men began to act on their own, driven by pure survival instinct. Some broke ranks and made a mad dash for the woods, hoping to escape on their own, only to be hunted down and killed by the waiting Germans. Others simply gave up, falling to their knees in the mud, overwhelmed by exhaustion and despair, waiting for the final blow. The concept of the legion, of the collective, was dying. The pyramid of command had been shattered, its pieces scattered in the bloody mire of the Teutoburg Forest. All that was left were thousands of terrified, isolated men, stumbling through a green hell, with no one to lead them and nowhere to go. By the third day, the Roman force was a ghost of itself. The 17th, 18th, and 19th legions had ceased to exist as coherent military formations. What remained was a ragged, stumbling column of survivors, perhaps numbering in the few thousands, a desperate mix of legionaries, auxiliaries, and a handful of terrified civilians who had managed to keep up. They were starving, wounded, and operating on the very last reserves of human endurance. Their flight had been a nightmare of relentless attacks and slow attrition, but the terrain, while difficult, had at least been consistent. Now that was about to change. The path ahead, guided by the unseen hand of Arminius, was narrowing. The landscape began to shift in a subtle but terrifying way. On the right side of the track, the woods gave way to a vast, impassable bog. It was a great, marshy swamp, a treacherous expanse of stagnant black water and sucking peat, hidden by tall reeds. To enter it meant certain death, a slow, suffocating drowning in the mire. It formed a perfect, natural barrier, preventing any attempt by the Romans to break out or maneuver to their right. Their path was now rigidly defined, their flanks secured not for them but for their enemy. And on their left side, the ground began to rise sharply, forming a steep, wooded hill that ran parallel to the swamp. This was Calcrisa Hill. The forest on its slopes was particularly dense, ancient, and dark, offering perfect cover for the German warriors. The track the Romans were forced to follow now became a constricted channel, a narrow corridor of land no more than a few hundred yards wide, caught in a deadly vice between the impassable swamp on one side and the menacing, forest-clad hill on the other. And every legionary in the column, no matter how exhausted or demoralized, would have recognized the terrifying tactical implications of this terrain. They were being funneled. The wide front of their march was being squeezed into a tight, compressed bottleneck. They were being herded like cattle into a slaughter pen. The sense of dread, which had been a constant companion for 2 days, now intensified into a palpable, suffocating certainty of doom. There was no room to form a battle line, no space to maneuver, no possibility of retreat, and no escape to the flanks. They were being forced down a path from which there was only one exit, and as they trudged deeper into this natural trap, a few of the more observant soldiers might have noticed something strange about the base of the hill on their left. There appeared to be a low, continuous mound of earth running along it, paralleling their path. It was covered in grass and bracken, made to look like a natural feature of the landscape, a simple fold in the land. It seemed insignificant, just another feature of this cursed forest, but it was not natural. It was a work of human hands, a carefully constructed and brilliantly camouflaged earthen rampart, built in the days and weeks before the battle. It was a wall, a fortification, stretching for hundreds of yards along the narrowest part of the passage. And behind that wall, hidden from sight, the main body of the Germanic army, thousands of fresh, eager warriors were crouched in silence, gripping their spears, holding their breath, and waiting for the head of the Roman column to step into the heart of the killing ground. The trap, so meticulously planned, was now fully set. The final act of the massacre was about to begin. The head of the Roman column, a stumbling, ragged group of what was once the mighty 19th Legion, trudged wearily into the narrowest part of the passage. The air was thick with a dreadful, unnatural quiet. And then, the world exploded. All along the low, grassy mound at the base of the hill, the earth itself seemed to rise up. With a single, coordinated movement, thousands of Germanic warriors rose from behind their hidden rampart. For a terrifying second, they stood there silhouetted against the gray sky, a solid wall of shields and spears, before they unleashed hell upon the men below. This was not a skirmish. This was a firing squad. From the elevated and protected position of the wall, the Germans unleashed a volley of projectiles at point-blank range. It was a storm of death so dense and so overwhelming that it was impossible to miss. Heavy javelins, spears, axes, and massive sharpened stakes rained down directly into the packed ranks of the Romans. The effect was catastrophic. The front ranks of the column were annihilated where they stood, punched from their feet by the sheer weight of the missile fire. Men fell in heaps, their shields and armor offering no protection against the plunging, close-range attack. The narrow passage became instantly choked with the dead and dying, creating a gruesome barricade of bodies that blocked the path for those behind. The Roman advance came to a dead, horrifying halt. The front of the column, unable to move forward, recoiled in sheer panic, crashing into the men behind them. The entire Roman force, already compressed by the terrain, was now squeezed together into a dense, struggling mass of humanity. They were a stationary, perfect target. The Germans on the wall let out a roar of triumph and began their work with systematic, murderous efficiency. They did not need to charge. They could simply stand behind their fortification, almost immune to Roman return fire, and kill at will. They hurled down everything they had. Warriors would launch their spears, then grab another from the piles stockpiled behind them. Archers, their bows now effective in the slightly more open space, sent volley after volley of arrows into the writhing mass below. Men with slings whipped stones with bone-shattering force. It was a one-sided slaughter. The Romans, packed shoulder to shoulder, could barely raise their arms to defend themselves. They raised their shields above their heads, a desperate, futile attempt to form a testudo. But the sheer volume of missiles smashed the formations apart, breaking shields and crushing the men beneath them. Panic turned to sheer animal terror. There was nowhere to run. To the right was the swamp. To the left was the wall of death. Behind them, the rest of the column was still pressing forward, unaware of the horror unfolding at the front, while other German war bands emerged from the woods to attack the rear, sealing the trap completely. The Romans were caught in a perfectly designed killing box. Warriors on the wall, their bloodlust ignited, began to leap over their rampart, charging down the short, steep slope to engage in the final butchery. They swarmed over the dead and dying, their axes and long swords rising and falling, finishing off the wounded and cutting down any who still offered resistance. The last vestiges of Roman discipline evaporated in a final, agonized scream. It was no longer a battle. It was the systematic deconstruction of an army, a methodical, brutal, and terrifyingly personal massacre. The wall of death at Calcries was fulfilling its purpose. It was the anvil upon which the hammer of the Germanic tribes was shattering the last remnants of 3 Roman legions. In the heart of the swirling, desperate chaos of the killing ground, struggles of a different kind were taking place. These were not just fights for survival. They were fights for the very soul of Rome. Scattered throughout the dying army were the standard bearers, the most revered soldiers in any legion. There was the signifer of each century, who carried the signum, a pole adorned with medallions and topped with a silver hand, representing the oath of the soldiers. And then there was the most sacred of all, the aquilifer, one for each legion, the man entrusted with the aquila, the eagle. Eagle was not merely a flag or a banner. It was the living embodiment of the legion's honor, its pride, and its divine connection to the gods and the emperor. It was a masterfully crafted icon of silver or gold, a majestic eagle with its wings outstretched, clutching a thunderbolt in its talons. To lose an eagle in battle was the ultimate disgrace, a stain so profound that it could lead to the entire legion being disbanded in shame. The soldiers swore their sacred oath of allegiance upon it, and they would follow it into the mouth of hell. To protect the eagle was the highest duty of every man in the legion. As the battle turned into a one-sided massacre, the German warriors, instructed by Arminius, who knew their immense significance, began to hunt for these standards. They swarmed around the small, desperate pockets of legionaries who formed protective circles around their standard bearers. These last stands were pockets of insane, suicidal bravery in a sea of terror. The aquilifers, men chosen for their unwavering courage, held their sacred charges high, their knuckles white, their faces grim with determination. Around them, their comrades fought with the fury of despair, forming a wall of shields and bodies, knowing that this was the last meaningful act of their lives. NTHE fighting for the eagles was the most savage of the entire battle. The Germans, desperate to capture these potent symbols of Roman power, threw themselves at the small circles of defenders. The Romans, knowing the depth of the shame that would follow their loss, fought with a strength that defied their exhaustion and wounds. Swords rose and fell, shields splintered, and men screamed as they died at the base of the standards, their bodies forming a rampart for their comrades. NBUT. The outcome was inevitable. One by one, the circles were overwhelmed. The Aqualifer of the 17th Legion, seeing his last defenders fall, might have tried to break the eagle from its staff, to hide it, to bury it in the mud to keep it from enemy hands. But he was cut down, and the triumphant Germans seized the pole, wrenching the silver bird from the mud and raising it high with a roar of victory. Elsewhere, the bearer of the 18th's eagle, wounded and cornered, might have used his last ounce of strength to charge into the thickest of the fighting, hoping to die and take the standard with him into the press of bodies where it might be lost. But he too was surrounded and killed, the eagle torn from his dying grasp. NTHE capture of each eagle sent a shockwave of despair through any Roman who witnessed it. To see their sacred symbol, the embodiment of their invincibility, held aloft by a jeering barbarian, was the final crushing psychological blow. It was the moment they knew, with absolute certainty, that their legion was dead, their honor was lost, their spirit was broken, the gods had abandoned them. With the fall of the eagles of the 17th, the 18th, and the 19th legions, the battle ceased to be a fight for survival. It became the final, agonizing death throe of an army that had lost its soul in the bloody mud of the Teutoburg Forest. In the midst of the final slaughter, somewhere within the shrinking pocket of the last Roman survivors, Publius Quinctilius Varus finally understood. The fog of his disbelief, the paralysis of his shock, had been burned away by the undeniable, absolute horror of the reality before him. He saw the bodies of his men piled in heaps. He saw the sacred eagles of his legions held aloft as trophies by the warriors he had so casually dismissed. He saw the face of Arminius triumphant in the distance, the architect of his ruin. He saw the complete and utter annihilation of 3 Roman legions, an army entrusted to his care by the emperor himself. In this moment of dreadful clarity, there was no longer any hope of victory, no chance of escape, no possibility of an honorable defeat. There was only shame, a shame so vast, so monumental, it was beyond the comprehension of most men. He had lost everything, his army, his honor, the trust of his emperor, and Rome's pride. He knew what his fate would be if captured. He would be paraded through the Germanic villages, a living symbol of Rome's humiliation. His head would likely be sent to some great chieftain as a trophy. He would be remembered in Roman history not as a governor or a consul, but as the man who lost 3 legions, a name that would be spoken as a curse for centuries to come. NFOR, a man of the Roman senatorial class, a man raised on stories of honor and duty. Such a fate was worse than death. There was a deeply ingrained tradition for Roman commanders in such hopeless situations, a final act of control in a world where all control had been lost. It was the devotio, the ultimate sacrifice, but stripped of all its glory. It was suicide. Surrounded by the last of his loyal officers and bodyguards, men who were preparing to sell their lives dearly in a final, futile stand, Varus made his choice. He would not give Arminius the satisfaction of his capture. He would not allow his person to become a symbol of his enemy's victory. He would die as a Roman, even if he had failed as a Roman commander. NTHE act itself would have been grim, quiet, and methodical. There was no ceremony, no final speech. He would have turned to his most trusted remaining legate, his face a mask of grim resolve. Perhaps they exchanged a single, knowing glance. Then, Varus would have unbuckled his own sword, the gladius that he likely had not drawn in anger during the entire battle. He would not have fallen upon it in a dramatic, theatrical gesture. Instead, with the help of a loyal officer or even a slave, he would have held the hilt while the other aimed the point at his heart. A brief, sharp intake of breath, a final thought of Rome, of his family, of the emperor he had so catastrophically failed. And then, a single, decisive thrust. Varus slumped to the ground, his lifeblood staining the muddy earth of the forest that had consumed him. His senior officers followed his example. One by one, the remaining legates and high-ranking tribunes, men who shared in his command and now shared in his disgrace, fell on their own swords. It was a final, desperate act of Roman pride in the heart of their greatest humiliation. They chose a quick, self-inflicted death over the slow, agonizing, and shameful one that awaited them at the hands of their captors. Their deaths were not heroic. They were the bleak, final punctuation mark on a sentence of utter and complete failure. With the suicide of Varus and his senior command, the last semblance of organized Roman resistance evaporated. The battle, which had devolved into a massacre, now descended into something even more primal. For the Germanic warriors, this was not just a military victory. It was a moment of catharsis, the unleashing of a generation of pent-up hatred, humiliation, and rage. The discipline of the battle gave way to the frenzy of vengeance, and for the Roman survivors, the fighting's end was simply the beginning of a new and more terrible ordeal. There would be no quarter. There would be no mercy. Germans swarmed through the killing ground, their faces alight with a terrifying, ecstatic fury. They moved among the heaps of Roman dead and wounded with axes and clubs, methodically finishing off any soldier who still showed a sign of life. A legionary, lying helpless with a shattered leg, would look up to see the wild, bearded face of a warrior looming over him, a moment of eye contact before an axe fell, and his world went dark. The groans of the wounded were systematically silenced, one by one, until the only sounds were the triumphant shouts of the victors and the ever-present rain. Prisoners were rounded up, not to be ransomed or enslaved in the traditional sense, but to serve a darker purpose. They were dragged from hiding places in the woods or pulled from beneath the bodies of their comrades, their pleas for mercy met with contemptuous laughter. They were stripped of their armor and herded into groups, their terror palpable as they were surrounded by the warriors who had just slaughtered their friends. They were now spoils of war, objects upon which the Germans would enact their final ritualistic revenge. Highest-ranking officers and centurions who had been captured alive were reserved for the most gruesome fates. They were seen as the direct instruments of Roman oppression, the men who had presided over the tribunals and enforced the hated taxes. They were dragged before makeshift altars erected in sacred groves deep within the forest. There, under the dripping branches of ancient oaks, Germanic priests in dark robes would begin their grim ceremonies. The Roman officers were sacrificed to the Germanic gods of war, their throats cut and their blood spilled upon the roots of the sacred trees as a libation of thanks for the great victory. Their heads were severed and mounted on tree trunks, their sightless eyes staring out over the field of their defeat. And other prisoners were subjected to tortures of unimaginable cruelty, a direct and symbolic reversal of their own methods of punishment. Men who had carried out crucifixions were themselves nailed to trees. Some were buried alive. Others were burned in wicker cages, their screams echoing through the forest as a warning to the Roman world. The Germans, vengeance was not just about killing. It was about eradicating every trace of Roman authority and pride with a theatrical and horrifying brutality. They wanted to send a message, written in blood and terror, that this land would never, ever be Roman. For the few who managed to escape, hiding in the swamps and woods, the sights and sounds of that long, terrible day and the night that followed would be seared into their minds forever, a vision of hell on earth from which there could be no recovery. After the frenzy came the silence. A profound, unnatural quiet descended upon the Teutoburg Forest, a silence made heavier by the sheer scale of the death that had preceded it. The triumphant shouts of the warriors faded as they departed, laden with captured armor, weapons, and the severed heads of their enemies, returning to their villages to celebrate their impossible victory. The last screams of the dying had long been extinguished. All that remained was the wind, the rain, and the dead. Battlefield was a vision of apocalyptic devastation, a scene that would have defied the darkest imagination. For miles along the narrow, muddy track, the ground was invisible, hidden beneath a carpet of human bodies. More than 20,000 people, Legionaries, auxiliaries, and civilian followers lay dead in the German forest. They lay where they had fallen, a grotesque tableau of the battle's final, chaotic moments. Men were piled 3 and 4 deep in the narrow passage by Culcrease Hill, their limbs entangled in a final, desperate embrace. They lay half-submerged in the mud and pools of bloody water, their once proud armor tarnished and broken. NTHE forest floor was littered with the debris of a destroyed army, splintered shields, broken swords, shattered helmets, and the thousands of heavy javelins that had been hurled in the attack. The skeletons of the burned-out wagons stood as grim monuments, their contents spilled and trampled into the mire. The personal effects of the soldiers, a dropped coin, a letter from home that would never be read, a small, carved good luck charm, were scattered amongst the carnage, silent, pathetic testaments to the thousands of individual lives that had been extinguished here. And as the days turned into weeks, nature, indifferent to human tragedy, began its slow work of reclamation. The rain washed the blood from the leaves but soaked the ground with it, turning the earth a dark, fertile red. Moss began to grow over the rims of discarded helmets. Vines snaked around the hilts of swords half buried in the mud. The bodies, left unburied and exposed to the elements, were attended to by the creatures of the forest. Wolves, drawn by the scent of death, crept from the shadows to feast on the dead. Flocks of crows and ravens descended, their black forms covering the battlefield, their harsh cries the only eulogy the fallen would receive. This was the grim monument to Roman arrogance. It was a warning, a statement of defiance written in bone and rusting iron. The Germans left the bodies to rot, a deliberate act to ensure that any Roman who might venture into this forest in the future would see the price of their ambition. The skulls of the sacrificed officers remained nailed to the trees, bleached white by the sun and rain, their empty eye sockets staring out over the valley of their demise. The forest had swallowed 3 legions whole, digesting them slowly, turning their pride and power into nothing more than nutrients for its ancient soil. The silence that reigned was not one of peace, but of victory and annihilation, a chilling testament to the day the unconquerable frontier rose up and devoured its conquerors. The news of the disaster did not travel quickly. For weeks, the Roman world remained blissfully unaware of the horror that had unfolded in the German forest. The forts along the Rhine waited for the arrival of Varus and his legions, their mood shifting slowly from expectation to concern, and then to a gnawing dread. The first hints of the catastrophe came not from an official report, but from the terrified, incoherent accounts of the handful of survivors who, by some miracle, had managed to escape the slaughter and stumble their way through hostile territory back to Roman lines. They were gaunt, traumatized specters, their eyes wide with the horrors they had witnessed, their stories a fragmented nightmare of ambush, betrayal, and annihilation. And at first, their tales were met with disbelief. 3 entire legions lost, the 17th, the 18th, and the 19th, gone? It was unthinkable, a calamity on a scale that had not been seen since the darkest days of the Republic, when Hannibal had shattered Roman armies at Cannae over 2 centuries earlier. But as more survivors trickled in, their stories corroborating the impossible, the dreadful truth began to dawn on the Roman commanders at the Rhine. A frantic message was dispatched to Rome, carried by the fastest riders, a message bearing the worst news the empire had received in 100 years. NTHE news arrived in the heart of the world, the city of Rome, and it struck the capital like a physical blow. The initial disbelief gave way to a wave of collective shock and panic. The city, which had felt so secure, so invulnerable in its power, was suddenly gripped by fear. Germania was not some distant, exotic land. It was just across the Alps. The fear was that Arminius, having destroyed Rome's northern army, would now unite the tribes, sweep across the Rhine and invade Gaul, or even Italy itself. The city guards were doubled. A tense, fearful watch was kept. The mood of imperial confidence that had defined the age of Augustus was, for the first time, shattered. NTHE news was carried into the halls of the imperial palace on the Palatine Hill and delivered to the emperor himself. Augustus was now an old man, over 70 years old. He was no longer the vigorous, ruthless Octavian who had forged the empire from the ashes of civil war. He was a weary, aging statesman who had dedicated his life to securing peace and stability for the Roman world. The Pax Romana was his greatest achievement, his legacy. The Varian disaster, as it came to be known, was not just a military defeat, it was a personal failure, a stain on the glorious tapestry of his long reign. The Emperor was utterly broken by the news. The loss of 20,000 Roman citizens, the disgrace of 3 lost eagles, the humiliation of the defeat. It was a blow from which his spirit would never recover. He fell into a deep, dark depression. He let his hair and his beard grow long, a traditional Roman sign of deep mourning. He tore his robes in grief and fury. For months, the halls of the palace, once a symbol of serene and absolute power, were filled with the emperor's anguish. He would be seen wandering the corridors aimlessly, his mind lost in the horror of the event. And in the grip of his grief, he would often stop, slam his head against a marble wall, and cry out in a voice filled with rage and sorrow, a desperate, futile plea to the ghost of his failed general. Quintilivar, legiones rede. Quinctilius Varus, give me back my legions. It was the cry of a heartbroken father, a shamed emperor, and a man confronting the brutal, bloody limits of his own power. It was the lament of an empire that had suddenly, terrifyingly, been reminded of its own mortality. The dream of a Roman province stretching to the Elbe River was dead, and in its place was a nightmare that would haunt the Roman psyche for generations to come. In the wake of the Varian disaster, the Roman response was swift and driven by 2 powerful, competing emotions: a burning desire for revenge and a new, deep-seated fear of the Germanic wilderness. The panic that had gripped Rome subsided, replaced by a grim imperial resolve. The immediate threat of a German invasion of Gaul was countered by the future emperor Tiberius, who rushed to the Rhine with fresh legions. He was not there to conquer, but to stabilize, to hold the line, to ensure the catastrophe did not spread. The open, fluid frontier that Varus had so carelessly managed was no more. In the years that followed, Rome would seek its vengeance. Under the command of the brilliant young general Germanicus, the son of Drusus, and a figure of immense popularity, Roman legions would once again cross the Rhine. These were not campaigns of occupation and administration, they were punitive expeditions, brutal raids designed to punish the tribes who had participated in the massacre, to burn their villages, and to re-establish the terror of the Roman name. During one of these campaigns, Germanicus and his men marched to the site of the battle in the Teutoburg Forest. It was 6 years after the slaughter, but the scene was still one of unimaginable horror. They found the field of bones, the whitened skeletons of their countrymen lying where they had fallen. They saw the skulls of the sacrificed centurions still nailed to the trees in the German sacred groves. They found the remnants of the crude camp from the first night, the ditches filled with the dead. It was a profoundly traumatic experience for the soldiers, many of whom had known men who died there. With solemn reverence, they gathered the remains of their fallen comrades, friends and strangers alike, and buried them together in a single great funeral mound, a final, belated act of honor for the lost legions. Germanicus's campaigns were militarily successful. He defeated Arminius in open battle, and even recovered 2 of the 3 lost eagles, a significant symbolic victory that brought some measure of solace to Rome. His forces also captured Thusnelda, Arminius's wife, who was paraded in Germanicus's triumph in Rome, a living trophy of the renewed Roman might. NBUT. These were acts of revenge, not of conquest. The fundamental strategic reality had changed. The Varian disaster had poisoned the very idea of conquering Germania. The cost in blood and treasure was now deemed too high, the risks too great. The deep, dark forests that had swallowed 3 legions had created a psychological barrier that would prove more formidable than any wall. The Emperor Augustus, in his final years, and his successor Tiberius, made a momentous decision. The dream of expanding the empire to the Elbe River was officially abandoned. The new frontier would be the Rhine. This great river, which had once been seen as a highway into Germania, was now to become a wall. A massive permanent military infrastructure was established along its western bank. A chain of forts, watchtowers, and legionary fortresses was built, creating a heavily militarized zone known as the Limes Germanicus. For the next 400 years, this would be the edge of the Roman world. The legions would stand guard, their eagles facing east, staring out across the river at the lands they would never conquer. The Teutoburg Forest had done more than destroy 3 legions. It had halted the seemingly unstoppable Roman Empire in its tracks. It had defined the limits of power and carved the future map of Europe, creating a permanent division between the Latin Romanized world to the west and the Germanic world to the east, a division whose echoes would resonate for centuries to come. And what of the victor? What became of the man who had achieved the impossible? The Cheruscan prince, who had humbled the most powerful empire on earth. Arminius, the man the Romans would forever call the betrayer, was hailed by his own people as a liberator. His name was sung in the victory feasts, his deeds recited in the epic poems of the Germanic tribes. He had done what no chieftain before him had ever managed. He had united the perpetually feuding tribes, if only for a moment, and led them to a victory that would secure their freedom for generations. He was the undisputed hero of Germania, NBUT, the very qualities that had made him a brilliant conspirator and war leader. His ambition, his intelligence, his understanding of centralized power learned in Rome now made him an object of suspicion among his own people. The unity he had forged in the crucible of rebellion was fragile. Once the common enemy had been pushed back across the Rhine, the old rivalries and jealousies quickly resurfaced. The chieftains who had followed him into battle were proud, independent men who guarded their own power jealously. They had followed a war leader. They would not bow to a king. Arminius, however, saw the necessity of a permanent unified German nation to stand against the inevitable return of Roman power. He argued for a stronger alliance, a centralized command, with himself, naturally, at its head. But his countrymen, who had just thrown off the yoke of one empire, were deeply suspicious of any man who sought to create another, even if he was one of their own. They saw in his ambition the shadow of the Roman tyrants they had just defeated. His old rival and father-in-law, Segestes, who had fled to the Roman side, actively worked against him, sowing discord and painting him as a would-be despot. NHI's final years were consumed by bitter infighting, a series of draining internal conflicts against other Germanic warlords, most notably Maroboduus, the king of the Marcomanni. Arminius was victorious in these struggles, his tactical genius undiminished. But every victory against a fellow German further alienated him from the very people he had fought to free. He was a man out of time, a visionary leader whose people were not yet ready for his vision. The great liberator found himself increasingly isolated, feared as much as he was revered. NHI's end, when it came, was not on a glorious battlefield fighting the Romans. It was ignominious, personal, and deeply tragic. In the year 21 AD, just 12 years after his monumental victory in the Teutoburg Forest, Arminius was assassinated. He was not killed by a Roman agent, but by his own kinsmen, members of his own tribe and family, who, as the Roman historian Tacitus would later write, feared his growing power and his aspirations to kingship. He was struck down in the dark, a victim of the same kind of conspiracy and betrayal that he himself had once so masterfully employed against Varus. He died at the age of just 37. He was a man who had held the fate of Europe in his hands, a man who had lived in 2 worlds and had mastered them both. He defeated Rome, saved his people from subjugation, and drew a line in the blood-soaked soil of Germania that would alter the course of history forever. Yet, in the end, he was consumed by the very divisions he had sought to overcome. He was a liberator who was killed by the liberated, a unifier who fell to disunity. His legacy remains a complex and sorrowful one, the story of a man who won the war against his enemy, but lost the battle for the soul of his own people.